Tasha had just finished a long day at work and was heading home, walking down the quiet, dimly lit street. It was the kind of evening where everything felt calm, the kind of evening when nothing seemed out of place. The world was settling down, and all she wanted was to get to her apartment, take off her shoes, and relax. But things weren't going to be as peaceful as she hoped. As she walked, the sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention. She turned her head and saw two police officers standing on the sidewalk ahead of her. One of them was scanning her as if she were a suspect. Tasha's heart began to race. She had been stopped by the police before, but it was always unsettling. You never knew what to expect, and it often felt like they didn't need a reason to ask you questions or stop you. The officers stood in her path, forcing her to slow down. They didn't greet her or even ask if she was okay. Instead, one of the officers stepped forward, blocking her way with his arms crossed. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a flat tone. "Can I see your ID?" Tasha stopped in her tracks, confused. "My ID? What's this about?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. The officer didn't explain himself, but instead repeated the question. "Can I see your ID?" His tone wasn't friendly. It was demanding, almost as if she had already done something wrong. Tasha didn't have any idea why she was being stopped. She was just walking home like anyone else would. "I don't understand," she said, keeping her voice calm, but her frustration was starting to show. "Why are you asking for my ID? I haven't done anything wrong." The second officer, who hadn't said much up until that point, stepped in. "You're acting suspicious," he said, his words like a slap to her face. "We just want to make sure everything's all right." Tasha tried to stay composed. "Suspicious? I'm just walking home. Why would I be suspicious?" The first officer didn't even look her in the eye. "You matched the description of someone we've been looking for," he said, as if it was supposed to make sense. "Now, give me your ID." Tasha could feel the blood rush to her face. "This is ridiculous," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can't just stop me because I look like someone else. This is unfair." Her words hung in the air, but the officers weren't listening. The second officer took a step closer, his posture growing more aggressive. "Look, ma'am, we're not asking for trouble. Just show us your ID, and this will be over quickly." The crowd that had gathered nearby was starting to take notice. People were walking by, glancing over at the scene, but most of them kept their distance. Some people even whispered to each other, but no one stepped in to help. Tasha felt completely alone. The officer's authority loomed over her like a heavy weight, and the crowd's silence only made her feel more isolated. Her mind raced. She knew that if she refused to show them her ID, things could escalate. But she also knew she was in the right. Why should she have to prove herself to them when she had done nothing wrong? She thought about her rights. She wasn't required to just hand over her identification unless there was a legitimate reason. But the officers didn't care about that. "Are you going to show us your ID, or do we need to take this further?" the first officer asked, his voice cold and commanding. Tasha felt the sting of his words. She knew that she could be in trouble if she didn't comply, but she also didn't want to give in to what felt like an unjust request. Her mind was running through options. She could keep arguing, but what would that achieve? The situation could easily spiral out of control. But if she just gave them her ID, they would leave her alone, and she could get back to her life. It felt like there was no good choice here. "I'm not going to give you my ID," Tasha said, her voice steady but firm. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment hanging between them like a sword ready to fall. The officer's face twisted into a scowl. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice rising slightly. He stepped forward, his presence more imposing now, as if he was trying to intimidate her into compliance. The second officer followed suit, standing even closer. Tasha could feel their judgment, their eyes following her every movement. She tried to stand her ground, but the situation felt like it was slipping out of control. As the officers hovered over her, demanding she comply. Tasha felt the anger and helplessness start to swell inside her. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every black person who had ever been unjustly treated by the police. She knew that no matter how calm she tried to remain, this situation wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the unfair treatment she and so many others faced every day. The crowd had grown a little, and people were whispering more openly now. A few people were taking out their phones, capturing what was happening. The officers didn't seem to notice, too focused on Tasha, trying to force her into submission. But as she stood there, she knew something had to change. Something had to break this cycle. But she couldn't do it alone. The tension in the air thickened as the officers continued to stand before Tasha, their demands growing more insistent. She felt trapped, caught between wanting to stand up for herself and the overwhelming pressure of the situation. The seconds felt like hours as she tried to process everything that was happening. The two officers were closing in on her, and the crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath. People watched, some curious, others worried about what might unfold next. The phones from the bystanders were now recording everything, capturing the moment on camera. Tasha could feel the weight of their gaze, and it only made the pressure more intense. "I told you, I'm not showing you my ID," Tasha repeated, her voice still calm, but starting to show signs of strain. She wasn't just refusing to comply out of defiance. She was doing it because she knew that something wasn't right. The way the officers were treating her wasn't fair, and deep down, she felt that this was a test she couldn't back down from. If she gave in, it would feel like giving up on the dignity she deserved. The first officer's expression shifted, his patience wearing thin. He took a step forward, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Ma'am, you're making this harder on yourself," he said with a forced smile, clearly trying to assert his authority. He had been trained to intimidate, to make people fall in line. But Tasha wasn't backing down. She refused to let him push her around, especially when she hadn't done anything wrong. The second officer, standing just to the side, crossed his arms and looked her over, like he was sizing her up. "You're just making this difficult," he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with annoyance. The tone of his words felt heavy, as if he believed that he had the right to treat her however he wished. Tasha could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Every word they said, every move they made, was designed to make her feel small, insignificant, as though she had no rights. She tried to stay calm, to remind herself that she wasn't the problem here. But it was hard. It was hard not to let their attitudes make her feel guilty for simply existing. She felt the familiar weight of frustration building inside her. How many times had she seen situations like this unfold? How many times had she heard stories of black people being unfairly treated by the police, simply because of their skin color? She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. But something inside her snapped, and she knew that she couldn't just let this moment pass quietly. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. "Why are you really stopping me?" Tasha asked, her voice no longer as calm as before. The question came out before she could stop it. She had to know. What was it about her presence, that made these officers feel like they had the right to treat her this way? The officers exchanged a quick look, and for a moment, it seemed like they were caught off guard by the question. "We've already explained, ma'am. You're just acting suspicious," the first officer responded, his voice cold. But Tasha could hear the uncertainty behind the words. They didn't have a real explanation, and that was the problem. "I'm acting suspicious," she repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "You've stopped me for no reason. You have no idea who I am, where I'm going, or what I'm doing. So why don't you just let me go?" She could feel her face growing warm as the anger bubbled up inside her. The more she thought about it, the more ridiculous the whole situation seemed. The officer didn't respond right away, and Tasha could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't prepared for someone to question him. He was used to people backing down, letting him have the upper hand. But she wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let him treat her like this without standing her ground. The crowd around them had started to grow, more people now standing and watching the exchange. The whispers were getting louder. Tasha could hear some people speaking up, asking why she was being stopped, why they were treating her this way. One person, an older man, even shook his head in disapproval, his arms folded across his chest. "That's just wrong," he muttered. Tasha didn't know if the officers heard him or not, but it seemed to have an effect. They were starting to realize that they were being watched, that their actions were being recorded. The weight of that reality hung heavy in the air, and for a brief moment, the officers paused. They exchanged another look, and it was clear that they were beginning to doubt their own reasoning. They had no real cause for suspicion, no real reason to be harassing her. But just as quickly, the first officer pushed forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we've been polite enough. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Either you show us your ID, or we'll have to take further action." His words were clipped, cold, and more forceful this time. Tasha's heart sank. She knew that further action could mean anything. She had heard the stories, seen the news. She knew what could happen when people were pushed too far. The feeling of powerlessness threatened to creep back in, but she refused to let it. She wasn't going to be another story. Not today. Just as the situation seemed ready to escalate even further, something unexpected happened. From the edge of the crowd, someone else stepped forward. A familiar face appeared in the distance, and Tasha's breath caught in her chest. It was her sister, Tara. Just as Tasha's mind was racing with frustration and uncertainty, she caught sight of a figure moving through the crowd. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized her twin sister, Tara. Tara's appearance was unmistakable. She had the same dark skin, the same sharp features, but there was something about the way she carried herself that was completely different. Unlike Tasha, who had felt the pressure mounting around her, Tara exuded an aura of calm confidence. It was like the very air shifted when she stepped into the scene. Tasha's relief was almost immediate. She wanted to shout her sister's name, but she didn't. She couldn't. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt like the moment could tip over into something much worse. But Tara didn't seem to have any hesitation. She moved with purpose, her steps firm and deliberate, as if she knew exactly what to do. As she got closer, the officers looked at her, momentarily distracted from Tasha. The first officer's eyes narrowed as he assessed Tara. She was confident, but her presence wasn't overbearing. She didn't demand attention. It was just there. Tara stopped a few steps away from the officers, standing tall but not aggressively. There was a quiet strength about her, a calmness that seemed to take the edge off the intensity of the situation. Tasha watched as Tara glanced at her briefly, her eyes full of understanding and reassurance. It was as if everything in Tasha's world suddenly felt more manageable. The storm that had been building inside her began to settle, knowing her sister was here to help. Tara looked at the officers with a gaze that didn't waver, and the energy shifted almost immediately. The two officers, still standing close to Tasha, couldn't seem to decide how to respond to Tara's presence. They were no longer the authority figures in control of the situation. Now they were on the defensive. "Is there a problem here?" Tara asked, her voice calm but firm, almost like a challenge. It wasn't rude, but it was clear she wasn't going to let this go without an explanation. The first officer hesitated, clearly thrown off by her question. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed unsure of how to phrase it. We're just questioning your sister," he said, though his words seemed less sure now, and his body language shifted, as if he was trying to keep his composure. Tara looked at Tasha, her expression softening just slightly before turning her gaze back to the officer. "Questioning her about what exactly?" Tara asked, her voice steady. The question was direct, but there was no anger in it, just a quiet, unwavering insistence that something didn't add up. The officer's eyes flickered, looking between Tasha and Tara, trying to find the words. "She's acting suspicious. We were just asking for her ID," he finally said, but there was a new hesitation in his voice. The certainty that had marked his tone earlier was gone. replaced by doubt. Tara wasn't shouting or demanding anything, but her quiet authority was undeniable. Tasha could feel her chest heighten with emotion. Tara had always been the stronger twin, the one who could stand tall and face whatever came her way. Tasha, on the other hand, had often been the one to second-guess herself, to try to smooth things over and avoid confrontation. But with Tara here, something inside her shifted. She no longer felt alone. The second officer, who had been mostly silent up until now, stepped in. "We're just doing our job," he muttered, but his words seemed even less convincing than the first officer's. Tara didn't let it slide. "Doing your job," Tara repeated, her voice gaining a little edge now. "Because you stopped my sister for walking down the street. You're accusing her of acting suspicious for no reason, and you want her to hand over her ID like she's some criminal. That doesn't sound like doing your job to me." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, and the first officer frowned, clearly losing the upper hand. Tara's words hung in the air like a challenge. She wasn't yelling, wasn't being rude. She was simply holding them accountable. She wasn't afraid of them. And for a moment, the officers didn't know how to respond. They were used to people backing down, to people apologizing for things they hadn't done, but Tara wasn't backing down. Tasha felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she stood there, watching her sister handle the situation with such calm control. Tara's presence was like a shield, protecting Tasha from the unfair treatment that had been building up around her. She knew this moment wouldn't last forever, but she also knew that with Tara there, things had changed. It was like the power balance had shifted. The officers now seemed unsure, even slightly defensive, under the calm scrutiny Tara directed at them. "Do you have any idea what it's like for people to be treated this way?" Tara continued, her voice calm but cutting. "To be stopped on the street, to be questioned for nothing other than the way you look. You think this is just your job? Well, I'm telling you, it's not." The crowd, which had been watching in silence, was now murmuring among themselves. People were starting to gather closer, some nodding in agreement with Tara's words. Phones were still recording, capturing every word, every move. The officers seemed to realize that this wasn't going to go as they had planned. The pressure of the crowd, the attention on them, was beginning to weigh heavily on their shoulders. Tara's gaze didn't falter as she addressed the officers again. "You're not going to find anything, so I suggest you let my sister go. This isn't your call anymore." The first officer glanced nervously at the second officer, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They had no real reason to detain Tasha, and Tara's calm but unwavering stance was beginning to make them realize they had no leg to stand on. The tension in the air seemed to break just slightly, but the officers still hesitated. They knew they had lost control of the situation, and as they stood there, unsure of how to proceed, Tara's calm determination remained the dominant force in the scene. She wasn't threatening or demanding anything. She was simply making it clear that she wasn't going to let them continue this injustice. And with that, the dynamic of the moment had shifted completely. The officers seemed to be struggling with their next move. Tara's calm, composed presence had caught them off guard. They weren't used to being questioned like this, and it was clear that their authority was starting to crumble. Tasha watched her sister with a deep sense of admiration, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders. Tara wasn't just standing up for her. She was standing up for everything that was wrong in that moment, everything that had led to Tasha being unfairly stopped in the first place. Tasha could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but with Tara by her side, she no longer felt so small, so powerless. The people around them had started to murmur more openly now, some nodding their heads in agreement with Tara's words. It was like the entire situation had shifted from one of tension and intimidation to something entirely different, something that felt like a small but significant stand against injustice. Tara looked at Tasha, her expression softening just slightly before turning her gaze back to the officer. "Questioning her about what exactly?" Tara asked, her voice steady. The question was direct, but there was no anger in it, just a quiet, unwavering insistence that something didn't add up. The officer's eyes flickered, looking between Tasha and Tara, trying to find the words. "She's acting suspicious. We were just asking for her ID," he finally said, but there was a new hesitation in his voice. The certainty that had marked his tone earlier was gone, replaced by doubt. Tara wasn't shouting or demanding anything, but her quiet authority was undeniable. Tasha could feel her chest tighten with emotion. Tara had always been the stronger twin, the one who could stand tall and face whatever came her way. Tasha, on the other hand, had often been the one to second-guess herself, to try to smooth things over and avoid confrontation. But with Tara here, something inside her shifted. She no longer felt alone. The second officer, who had been mostly silent up until now, stepped in. "We're just doing our job," he muttered, but his words seemed even less convincing than the first officer's. Tara didn't let it slide. "Doing your job," Tara repeated, her voice gaining a little edge now. "Because you stopped my sister for walking down the street. You're accusing her of acting suspicious for no reason, and you want her to hand over her ID like she's some criminal. That doesn't sound like doing your job to me." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, and the first officer frowned, clearly losing the upper hand. Tara's words hung in the air like a challenge. She wasn't yelling, wasn't being rude. She was simply holding them accountable. She wasn't afraid of them. And for a moment, the officers didn't know how to respond. They were used to people backing down, to people apologizing for things they hadn't done, but Tara wasn't backing down. Tasha felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she stood there, watching her sister handle the situation with such calm control. Tara's presence was like a shield, protecting Tasha from the unfair treatment that had been building up around her. She knew this moment wouldn't last forever, but she also knew that with Tara there, things had changed. It was like the power balance had shifted. The officers now seemed unsure, even slightly defensive, under the calm scrutiny Tara directed at them. "Do you have any idea what it's like for people to be treated this way?" Tara continued, her voice calm but cutting. "To be stopped on the street, to be questioned for nothing other than the way you look. You think this is just your job. Well, I'm telling you, it's not." The crowd, which had been watching in silence, was now murmuring among themselves. People were starting to gather closer, some nodding in agreement with Tara's words. Phones were still recording, capturing every word, every move. The officers seemed to realize that this wasn't going to go as they had planned. The pressure of the crowd, the attention on them, was beginning to weigh heavily on their shoulders. Tara's gaze didn't falter as she addressed the officers again. "You're not going to find anything, so I suggest you let my sister go. This isn't your call anymore." The first officer glanced nervously at the second officer, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They had no real reason to detain Tasha, and Tara's calm but unwavering stance was beginning to make them realize they had no leg to stand on. The tension in the air seemed to break just slightly, but the officers still hesitated. They knew they had lost control of the situation, and as they stood there, unsure of how to proceed, Tara's calm determination remained the dominant force in the scene. She wasn't threatening or demanding anything. She was simply making it clear that she wasn't going to let them continue this injustice. And with that, the dynamic of the moment had shifted completely. The officers seemed to be struggling with their next move. Tara's calm, composed presence had caught them off guard. They weren't used to being questioned like this, and it was clear that their authority was starting to crumble. Tasha watched her sister with a deep sense of admiration, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders. Tara wasn't just standing up for her. She was standing up for everything that was wrong in that moment, everything that had led to Tasha being unfairly stopped in the first place. Tasha could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but with Tara by her side, she no longer felt so small, so powerless. The people around them had started to murmur more openly now, some nodding their heads in agreement with Tara's words. It was like the entire situation had shifted from one of tension and intimidation to something entirely different, something that felt like a small but significant stand against injustice. Tasha let out a slow breath, her body relaxing as the tension finally began to dissipate. She turned to her sister, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Tara had saved her from a situation that could have easily escalated. Without her sister's intervention, who knew what might have happened, the officers might have tried to force her into their narrative, make her feel guilty for something she hadn't done, and she might have been powerless to stop it. But with Tara there, the outcome was different. The unjust treatment she had faced was now over, and she felt like she could breathe again. The crowd, which had been watching in silence, slowly began to disperse. Some people gave Tara small nods of approval, others muttered their thanks quietly, and a few even approached Tasha, offering her a smile of solidarity. Tasha smiled back, but her thoughts were still with the officers. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had been in situations like hers, without someone like Tara there to step in. She felt a deep sadness at the thought, but she also felt something else. Hope. Hope that people could stand up against injustice, that they could hold others accountable. Hope that change was possible. As Tasha and Tara began walking away from the scene, the tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to dissipate with every step. Tasha couldn't help but look over her shoulder at the officers one last time. She knew they had no right to stop her, but it still felt surreal, like the whole situation had been some kind of dream. The unfair treatment, the way the officers had treated her like a suspect for simply walking down the street, was something that people talked about, but it didn't feel real until it happened to you. "Are you okay?" Tara asked, her voice soft, but filled with concern as she walked beside her sister. Her tone was completely different from the one she had used with the officers. It was gentle and comforting, a stark contrast to the calm authority she had shown earlier. Tasha nodded, though she wasn't sure if she fully believed herself. "I think so," she said quietly. "I didn't expect it to go like that. I thought they were just going to make me show my ID and let me go. But when they started getting pushy, I didn't know what to do." Her voice trailed off, and she felt a mixture of relief and frustration welling up inside her. Tara reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did great. You stayed calm, even when things got tense." Her words were comforting, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet sadness that Tasha recognized all too well. Tara had always been the protector, the one who could stand up to anyone without a second thought, but Tasha knew that even Tara couldn't fix everything. "I shouldn't have had to deal with that," Tasha said, her voice growing a little stronger now. "I shouldn't have had to have you step in for me. Why does this keep happening? Why does it always feel like I'm guilty of something, just because of the color of my skin?" Tara's face softened as she glanced at her sister. "I don't know, Tasha. I don't have all the answers, but I know that what happened today wasn't your fault. It wasn't because of anything you did. It's because of the way the world is right now. People are judged by things that have nothing to do with who they are as a person. And it's not right." Tasha stopped walking for a moment, staring ahead at the street that seemed so much quieter now. She had been walking down this very street just minutes ago, minding her own business, unaware that her evening would turn into something so much bigger. The anger and frustration that had been swirling inside her now seemed to boil over. She wasn't angry just at the officers anymore, though she knew they had been wrong. She was angry at the world, at the system that allowed this kind of treatment to happen without question. "It's just so unfair," Tasha said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know how much longer I can deal with it. Every time I leave my house, I feel like I'm a target. I shouldn't feel like this. I shouldn't have to worry every time a police car drives by." Tara took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it's exhausting. It's draining to feel like you have to be on guard all the time. But you don't have to carry that burden alone. We have each other, and that's something powerful." Tasha looked over at her sister, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She had always known that Tara would be there for her, that no matter what happened, her sister would stand by her side. But it didn't make it any easier to face the world that seemed so unfair. I don't know what to do, Tara, Tasha said, her voice low. I don't know how to make things better. I don't know how to change things when they just keep happening over and over again. Tara stopped walking and turned to face her sister. She looked at Tasha for a long moment, her expression thoughtful, before she spoke. You're not going to change everything overnight, Tasha. I won't lie to you. There's still so much work to be done. But you're not alone in this. We can't fix everything at once. But if we keep standing up for ourselves, if we keep speaking out, maybe things will start to change, little by little. Tasha felt the weight of her sister's words sink in. Tara was right. It wasn't about fixing everything in one moment, or expecting one act of courage to solve it all. Change took time, and sometimes it felt like it would never come. But as long as they kept fighting, kept standing together, there was hope. The two sisters continued walking, and the conversation turned to lighter topics, as it always did when they needed a break from the heaviness of the world. They talked about their plans for the weekend, the movies they wanted to watch, and the places they hoped to visit when they had more time. But even as they spoke about the little things, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting, both within herself and in the world around her. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the world would ever change, or if things would ever feel truly equal. But what she did know was that, as long as she had Tara by her side, she would keep fighting. She would keep standing up for herself, for her sister, and for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. Together, they were stronger than they could ever be apart. Tasha's mind was full of questions and uncertainty, but as she walked next to Tara, she realized that maybe the most important thing was that they didn't have to face it alone. They had each other, and that, in itself, was a kind of strength, a kind of power. As Tasha and Tara continued walking down the quiet street, the weight of the evening's events slowly began to settle into Tasha's mind. The tension had faded, but the lingering frustration remained. The unfairness of what had happened, the way the officers had treated her, was something that she couldn't just shake off. It wasn't just about what happened tonight. It was the realization that these moments were part of a larger pattern, a pattern that had repeated itself countless times before, and would probably continue to do so. She glanced over at Tara, her sister walking beside her with her usual calm confidence. Tara had always been the one to take charge, to step in when things got tough. And tonight had been no different. But Tasha knew that Tara wasn't just a protector. She was also a person who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, just like everyone else. She'd seen Tara stand up for people, fight battles that weren't her own, and she admired her for it. But she also knew how exhausting it could be. "How do you do it?" Tasha asked, breaking the silence between them. "How do you stay so strong all the time? I feel like I can't handle it anymore, like it's too much sometimes." Tara turned to her sister, her expression softening. "I don't always feel strong, Tasha. I just do what I have to do because I don't have any other choice." She gave a small shrug, as if trying to downplay her own feelings. "I guess I just know that if I don't stand up, if I don't fight back, things will stay the same. And I can't just sit by and watch that happen." Tasha nodded, understanding the weight of Tara's words. She knew what it was like to feel overwhelmed, to feel like the world was pressing down on you from all sides. But Tara was different. She had a way of turning that frustration into action, of channeling her anger into something productive. Tasha, on the other hand, had always been more cautious, more reluctant to make waves. But tonight had shown her something. Tonight, she had seen how standing up for what was right could change the course of a situation. She wasn't sure how to find that strength on her own, but she knew she needed to. "I wish I could be more like you," Tasha admitted softly. "I wish I could just speak up without worrying about what might happen." Tara gave her a kind smile. "You can be like me. You just have to start believing that you have the power to make a difference too. You've always had that power, Tasha. You just haven't seen it yet. But tonight, you did great. You didn't back down, even when it felt like everything was against you." You stood up for yourself. Tasha didn't know how to respond. She felt grateful for her sister's words, but a part of her still felt unsure. She had never been one to rock the boat, to challenge authority or push back when things didn't feel fair. But now, after what had happened, she couldn't help but feel like there was more she could do. More that she should do. Maybe it was time to stop being so afraid of conflict, time to stop letting things slide just because it was easier. The thought lingered in her mind as they walked, the cool evening air brushing against their skin. Tasha realized that she wasn't just angry about what happened with the police. She was angry about the way so many people, especially black people, were treated unfairly every day. She was angry that so many were forced to live in fear of situations like the one she had just experienced. She knew that change wasn't something that could happen overnight, but maybe, just maybe, she could be part of that change. "You're right," Tasha finally said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to start speaking up. I want to stop letting these things slide, because it's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated like this. I want to do something that matters." Tara's eyes softened as she looked at her sister. "That's exactly the right attitude, Tasha. And I'll be right here with you, every step of the way. We can't do it alone, but we don't have to." Tasha felt a surge of gratitude for her sister. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that having Tara by her side made all the difference. It wasn't just about having someone to fight alongside her. It was about having someone who believed in her, who reminded her that she wasn't powerless. As they walked the rest of the way home, the conversation shifted to lighter topics again. They talked about their plans for the weekend, what they'd been reading lately, and the little things that made them smile. But underneath it all, something had changed for Tasha. The anger and frustration still lingered, but now it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. She wasn't going to sit back and let things happen to her anymore. She was going to take control of her own story, and she was going to fight for the kind of world she wanted to live in. Later that evening, as Tasha lay in bed, she reflected on everything that had happened. The anger she felt about the treatment she had endured was still there, but it wasn't as heavy. It had shifted into something else, something more powerful. She wasn't going to forget what happened, but she was going to use it to fuel her own growth, to help her find her voice in a world that often tried to silence people like her. She closed her eyes, feeling a small sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow was a new day, and with Tara by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The next day, Tasha woke up with a heavy heart, the events of the previous night still lingering in her mind. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, but it didn't bring the same warmth it usually did. She had a feeling, deep down, that things had shifted in her. The anger and frustration she had felt in the face of injustice hadn't disappeared overnight. In fact, it had only grown stronger. But now, there was something else, a sense of determination that she hadn't expected. Maybe it was Tara's words, or maybe it was the way she'd stood up for herself when she felt like everything was against her, but something inside her had changed. Tasha spent the next few hours thinking about what had happened and what she could do about it. The world was full of unfairness, and it often felt like nothing could be done to change it. But last night, Tara had shown her that standing up for yourself, no matter how small or quiet the act, could make a difference. It wasn't about starting some huge movement or trying to change everything at once. It was about refusing to let things go unnoticed, about refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice. It was about using her voice, no matter how scared she might feel, and knowing that her voice mattered. When Tasha finally made her way downstairs, Tara was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, and the sound of sizzling bacon was strangely comforting. It was a simple, quiet morning, but there was something different in the way Tara moved, in the way she looked at Tasha. She didn't say anything at first, but when Tasha walked into the room, Tara flashed her a smile. "How are you feeling today?" Tara asked, her tone warm but filled with understanding. She wasn't pushing, just giving Tasha the space to talk if she wanted to. Tasha sat down at the kitchen table and sighed. I'm still processing everything. I don't think I'll ever forget how I felt last night, but I don't want to just hold on to the anger, either. I want to do something with it. Tara placed a plate of pancakes in front of her sister and sat down across from her. I think that's the right approach. Anger can fuel change, but it's important to channel it into something positive. What's your plan? Tasha smiled a little, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement at the thought of finally doing something. I don't know yet. I think I want to start speaking up more. Maybe even get involved in the community somehow. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I know I can't just let things slide anymore. Tara nodded approvingly. That's a great start. And you don't have to have everything figured out right away. You can take it step by step. Every little action counts. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're in it together. As Tasha listened to her sister, she realized how much she had taken Tara's strength for granted. Tara had always been the one who took charge, who spoke out, who stood up for others. But now, Tasha saw that she, too, had the power to make a difference. It wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about being willing to act, to step into the uncomfortable spaces, and to use her voice to speak out against injustice. The day passed in a blur of quiet reflection and small, meaningful conversations between Tasha and Tara. They talked about the things they wanted to change, the things that mattered to them, and the ways they could contribute to the world around them. Tasha felt a growing sense of purpose, a feeling that she was finally moving in the direction she had been longing for. It was the first time in a long while that she felt like she was truly in control of her own destiny. Later that afternoon, Tara brought up an idea that she had been thinking about. You know, Tasha, there are a lot of organizations out there that are working to make a difference. Maybe you could look into volunteering or getting involved in one of them. It could be a good way to start making an impact, even in small ways. Tasha's eyes brightened. The thought of helping others, of being part of something bigger than herself, excited her. That sounds like a good idea, she said. I've been thinking about doing something to give back, but I wasn't sure where to start. There are a lot of options, Tara said. You could look into local advocacy groups or community organizations that focus on racial justice or helping people who've been treated unfairly. There are even online communities where people share resources and ideas on how to make a difference. The idea of volunteering, of contributing to something that mattered, made Tasha feel hopeful. For the first time, it felt like she was taking control of her own future. She wasn't going to let fear or uncertainty hold her back anymore. She had a responsibility to stand up for herself and for others, and now she had the courage to do it. Over the next few days, Tasha did some research. She found a few organizations that focused on racial equality, community outreach, and support for those affected by systemic injustice. Each group had a different focus, but they all shared a common goal: to bring about positive change. Tasha reached out to a couple of them, hoping to find a way to get involved. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and there was still a lot to learn, but she felt ready. Ready to be part of something bigger than herself. Tasha knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be easy to change a world that had been built on unfair systems and unequal power dynamics. But she also knew that every step, no matter how small, was a step toward progress. And every voice that spoke out, every person who stood up for what was right, was part of a larger movement that could create real change. As she sat down to write an email to one of the organizations, Tasha realized something important. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had her sister by her side, and she had the support of the community. Together, they could make a difference. It might take time, but Tasha was ready to do her part. With a deep breath, she hit send, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. The days following Tasha's decision to get involved were filled with a mix of emotions: excitement, uncertainty, and even a little bit of fear. She had taken that first step, but she knew there was still so much more ahead of her. The world she was stepping into wasn't always kind, and the problems were bigger than she could fix alone. But the thought that kept her going was that she wasn't alone. She had her sister, Tara, by her side, and she had the support of the community that she was slowly becoming a part of. One afternoon, after a few weeks of volunteering and attending meetings, Tasha sat in a small cafe with Tara, reflecting on how far she had come. When she had first walked away from that confrontation with the police, she had been angry and unsure of what to do next. But now she could see that her actions, her decision to speak up and get involved, had begun to make a difference, at least in her own life. Her feelings of powerlessness had started to fade, replaced by the understanding that change, while slow, was possible. "So, how's everything going with the volunteer group?" Tara asked, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Are you feeling like you're making progress?" Tasha smiled, but there was a hint of exhaustion in her eyes. "It's been a lot to take in, but I'm learning so much. The people in the group are amazing. They really care about the work they're doing. It's inspiring." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But it's also hard. Sometimes it feels like I'm just one person, and the problems are so big. Like, no matter how much we do, it's just a drop in the ocean." Tara nodded in understanding. "I get that. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when you're fighting something so big. But remember, change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small steps, in the little things that add up over time. Every conversation you have, every person you help, it all counts." Tasha reflected on Tara's words. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that it was true. She had started with small actions, joining the group, attending the meetings, speaking up when she saw something wrong. And those actions were beginning to make a difference, not just in the lives of the people she was working with, but in her own life too. She wasn't the same person she had been just a few weeks ago. She had found her voice, and that voice was now something she was learning to use to make a positive impact. "That's the part I'm still working on," Tasha said softly. "Believing that what I'm doing matters. I've spent so many years trying to keep my head down, trying not to make waves. But now it feels like everything I do matters, even if it's small." "You've always mattered, Tasha," Tara said, her voice full of warmth. "The thing is, we all matter. And when we use our voices together, that's when change starts to happen. You don't have to do everything by yourself." Tasha's heart swelled at her sister's words. She had always known that Tara was there for her, but hearing her speak with such conviction made Tasha realize something important. Tara was right. She wasn't alone. There were other people who cared, who were doing the same kind of work. And together, they could make a difference. It wasn't about changing the world overnight. It was about doing the right thing, day by day, and encouraging others to do the same. Over the next few weeks, Tasha continued to dedicate her time to the group. She attended more meetings, helped organize events, and worked alongside others who shared her passion for justice. Her confidence grew with every passing day, and she found herself taking on more responsibilities within the group. She was becoming a voice for those who had been silenced for too long, and with each step she took, she felt like she was doing the right thing. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Tasha was walking home when she saw the same street she had walked down the night the police had stopped her. It looked just like it had that night, but for some reason, it didn't feel the same. She walked with her head held high, her shoulders straight, her steps sure. The fear that had once gripped her heart was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of strength. She had faced fear head-on and had come out the other side stronger for it. Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Tara. It was simple but meaningful. "I'm proud of you. Keep going. You've got this." Tasha smiled, feeling the warmth of Tara's words wrap around her. She had come a long way, and she knew she still had a long journey ahead of her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. And no matter what obstacles came her way, she was ready to face them. When Tasha got home, she took a moment to sit quietly by the window, gazing out at the night sky. The stars were bright, and the city around her was full of life. She thought about everything she had been through, the uncertainty, the fear, the frustration, and she realized that those things didn't define her. What defined her was her ability to keep moving forward, her willingness to speak up, and her commitment to making the world a better place. She wasn't just a victim of injustice. She was a fighter, a change maker. And no matter how long it took, she was going to keep fighting. She wasn't just doing it for herself. She was doing it for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who deserved a voice. And that, she realized, was what made all the difference. With a sense of peace in her heart, Tasha stood up, ready to face whatever came next. The journey was far from over, but she knew now that she had everything she needed to see it through. And she wasn't alone. She had her sister, her community, and herself. Together, they could make a difference.